All right, as people start to filter into this evening's final and 102nd Manny Civic Cyber Conversation, I just want to welcome you all, and I really want to do a special shout out to Samantha Michaels for offering her time to conduct this conversation and interview. She is an incredible reporter with Mother Jones. She reports on criminal justice, and so I'm really honored and excited to pass this on to Samantha to be in conversation with Tal Klement, who has an amazing career and has shifted from the San Francisco Public Defender's Office to the District Attorney's Office. And I'm going to let Samantha and Tal get into that and talk about the topic at hand, which is rethinking jail. So they'll get into it, but I just want to welcome you all. I want to thank Samantha. I want to thank Tal for his time. I know you're probably very, very busy these days, so I just want to thank you for giving us some of your time. Tonight's conversation is about rethinking jail. And it is part of our Manny's Super Civic Cyber Conversation series. If you have a question, you can type the question into the Q&A box at any time. Samantha will be reading those questions after about 20 minutes of conversation. So you can type them in at any time. Q&A happens in about 20 minutes. And then we'll close the conversation in about 30 minutes. That's it. That's the conversation. And I'm going to stop my video right now and let Samantha take it away. Thanks so much, Samantha.
Awesome. Thanks, Manny, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to be talking about prisons and jails in the time of the coronavirus and what conditions are like now. We're also going to talk a bit about what are some steps that we can take to make them a little less inhumane and to reduce the incarcerated population in this country, which is currently enormous, more than 2 million people. And so, as Manny mentioned, we're here tonight with Tal Klement. He's an assistant district attorney in San Francisco, which means that he's one of the top prosecutors in the city. And he comes to this from a really interesting perspective because he and his boss, District Attorney Chesa Boudin, were previously working in the public defender's office, which means that they were representing people accused of crimes and trying to get them out of jail. Their office is currently making a lot of national news for the work that they're doing, trying to reform the criminal justice system, make it more fair for low-income people and people of color. So thanks, Tal, for joining us.
Thanks.
So to get started, let's talk about some of the conditions on the ground right now. We know that the coronavirus is spreading at really fast rates in prisons and jails around the country. There have been huge outbreaks at jails in New York City, Chicago, other places. In prisons where they're doing mass testing, they're finding, like in Ohio, that up to 75% of the population is infected. So can you talk a little bit about why incarcerated people are so vulnerable during this pandemic and what it tells us about conditions in these facilities, even during normal times?
Yes, well, I think it tells us a couple of different things. First of all, it's tragic to hear about some of the conditions in places like Ohio and the federal prison system where there have been mass outbreaks. And luckily, so far in San Francisco, we haven't seen that because of some of the steps that we've taken in conjunction with our partners. But the jail population is particularly vulnerable when you think about the demographics of who's incarcerated. You're talking about a majority of people who are indigent, oftentimes prior to being incarcerated, particularly in San Francisco, where we have a housing crisis. They're unhoused or marginally housed. They have co-occurring substance abuse issues and other issues that make them particularly at risk of contracting the COVID virus, and then more susceptible if they are in fact infected with the virus. So on top of that, you then have to think about the disproportionate number of people of color who are incarcerated and the devastating impact that COVID-19 is having on those communities. So you've got things like structural and institutional racism that have created, disparate health outcomes for those populations because of their economic vulnerability, environmental injustice like air quality issues, and then lack of access and disparate treatment in the healthcare system. So as a result, people of color are also more vulnerable to having the pre-existing conditions that compromise their immunity and make them make COVID more potentially lethal if in fact they are infected. So you've got these compounding factors of racial disparity that exist in our criminal justice system, and now this additional racial disparity in terms of health outcomes. And so what you have is a very vulnerable population. Then if you think about the way that the jails are structured, basically there is a real inability to do any kind of social distancing. I mean, individual inmates, individual persons in custody can't control who they interact with, whether it be staff or other inmates. They're basically put into a situation where they don't get to choose those things. And then in addition, you've got people coming in and out of those facilities, medical staff, correctional staff, program staff. And so there are people bringing the virus from the community into the jail. And then you also have, there's a lot of churn in terms of the people coming into jail. So you have people who are being booked into jail and then spending short amounts of time before they're either released on their own recognizance or charges are dropped. So you have a lot of people coming in and out of the jails. Then just the physical structures of the jail, in San Francisco, we still have County Jail 4, which is housed on top of our Hall of Justice. It was built, I think, in the 1950s. So we're talking about a 75-year-old jail. And if you can think about what a jail looks like in your kind of imagination, that's exactly what it looks like up there. It's long mainline corridors and then dormitories that, where individuals are kind of piled on top of each other in bunk beds. So there's very little space. And even in the newer facilities, inmates are, traditionally housed in bunk beds in close proximity to each other and use the same toileting facilities, the same hygiene facilities. So really it's an environment that's ripe for spreading a disease and spreading this particular virus, which seems to be easily spread just even through the air. So that's why I think we're seeing in places where they haven't taken any precautionary measures and when they've taken a harder line towards releasing people, that this virus has spread like wildfire in places like Ohio and in some prisons and federal system, things like that.
Mm-hmm. But some places are taking some precautions. Some cities are trying to get people out of jails and prisons. Courts are releasing some inmates early, and police departments are sometimes arresting fewer people. Can you talk about what San Francisco is doing to try to reduce its incarcerated population and what kind of challenges the city is running into?
Yes, I think we are in a better situation than most in that I think there has been, for the most part, a relatively unified response to this virus. I think DA Boudin has led the charge in terms of recognizing the gravity of this situation, but we've been able to work with the Sheriff's Department, we've been able to work with the courts, with the public defenders, with the police department to really minimize the number of people who are coming into the system. So we're trying to reduce that churn and also think about who's incarcerated and who we can safely release without affecting public safety. So we've done a variety of things. DA Boudin has been from the beginning guided by the public health experts. And pretty early on, the jail medical director suggested that in order for them to do any kind of social distancing and to properly quarantine people and treat people in custody or isolate people in custody, we'd really need to reduce our jail population to between 700 and 800 people from the average of about 1,200 people that it was before. So we've done a variety of things to make that happen, and we have in fact made that happen. So currently our jail population is around 720, 715. One of the things that we've done is we identified anyone who had a sentence of less than 60 days left to do, and we took a close look at every single case in that category and decided that we could release close to 50 people who only had 60 days left on their sentences without having an impact on public safety. We also identified inmates who were particularly vulnerable. So we looked at dates of birth of inmates, so identified inmates over the age of 60, and we worked directly with the jail medical staff to identify people who were potentially immunocompromised while also protecting their privacy, of course. And we were able to facilitate the release of some of those individuals directly into housing. The other thing that we've done is we've worked with the Sheriff's Department and the courts and the public defender to identify people who would qualify for the recent zero bail policy. The Chief Justice issued some emergency rules. Basically, they reduced bail for a lot of misdemeanors and felonies to a $0 amount. So we've worked on looking at that, looking at the people who are incarcerated, seeing who qualifies for that. And of course, we're doing our own vetting to make sure that we're not necessarily releasing anyone who poses a public safety risk, but we have been able to release a significant number of people that way. I should say that one of the benefits that we've had is that before this crisis, we had a policy of not seeking money bail. So we were already looking to alternatives to bail, like ankle monitors or stay away orders, things that wouldn't necessarily result in people being incarcerated pre-trial. And so unlike some other jurisdictions, we had probably more people out of custody already on cases, and I think that's really helped mitigate the effects of the virus. We're also looking at parole and probation violations and not pursuing technical violations for non-reporting, and working with the probation department to minimize the number of petitions that they're filing to seek probation violations. And we've also, although the emergency rules that were promulgated by the California Supreme Court allowed for a longer period of time before people were released after they were arrested for a charging decision to be made, we've stuck to the old rule, the 48-hour rule, so that we're continuing to make charging decisions in a timely fashion, even though the court allowed for a longer period of time that people could be incarcerated. We're doing all these different things to try and reduce the jail population, and we've had a great success. We are down again to around 700, which is what the jail medical director was indicating we would need to be at in order to safely social distance in custody, people in custody. And we also worked very closely with our community partners and with the jail staff, who've been excellent, particularly the jail medical staff, to really try and move people not just from custody to the streets, but to a safer place when they're out of custody. So we've put people in treatment, we've put people in housing directly. In limited circumstances, we've even put people who've tested positive. We only had a couple of positive tests for COVID-19, but we've been able to work with the Department of Public Health and find people quarantine beds. So it's really been a partnership, and that's probably been the biggest challenge. It's one thing to reduce the jail population. It's another thing to give people the appropriate options once they're released, and we don't want to release people into a more dangerous situation or put them more at risk once they're out there. So we've worked really closely with our community partners to make sure that hasn't happened.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really interesting. It seems like one lesson of this pandemic, as we're releasing more people from prisons and jails and not necessarily seeing an uptick in crime, is that maybe it wasn't necessary to be incarcerating so many people in the first place. Do you agree with that? And what other lessons do you hope that we'll take away from this time?
Well, we've released a significant number of people so far, and so far we haven't seen a significant rise in crime rates. In fact, crime rates continue to be on a downward trajectory. That was the case for the most part before the COVID virus. Since the COVID virus, obviously everyone's sheltering in place, but we've seen a 20 to 30% reduction in calls for service, according to the San Francisco Police Department. And we're seeing less people coming into the jails. Before the COVID virus, there was approximately 45 to 50 people a day who were coming into the jail on new bookings. Since then, the average is around 20 to 25. So it certainly suggests we can reduce our jail population without seeing, and significantly reduce 40%, without seeing a big spike in crime. Of course, there are going to be outliers, and there are going to be people who commit crimes once they're released. We have had a few situations where that has happened, but DA Boudin, to his credit, has been committed to making these decisions based on data and based on the advice from public health experts, and not based on the politics of fear, which has motivated so many criminal justice policies in the past. And so far, there isn't really any data to suggest this has caused a major uptick. We'll keep track of that, of course, and we'll adjust accordingly. But I think what it shows is that there are categories of people who are incarcerated who don't pose a public safety risk and can be out of custody, and that we have other means to keep track of people, like electronic monitoring, home detention, stay away orders, even just looking closely at the different types of cases that people are in custody for and the different risks that people pose, and using public safety really as our guiding force and seeing that if someone doesn't pose a public safety risk, there really is no reason for them to be held in custody. So this is kind of a natural experiment, but I would suggest that it does show, yes, that we can reduce our jail population and not necessarily see, an increase in crime.
Okay. And I'm curious to talk a bit more about some of the changes that you'd like to see even after this coronavirus crisis ends. Your boss, DA Chesa Boudin, got a lot of attention when he was elected last year for promising some pretty big changes to make the system more fair to low-income people and people of color. So as you work with him now, what are one or two of the biggest changes that you think that we need to see in the jail system even after this crisis ends?
Well, I think we can't ignore the racial disparity that we see in our jail population. San Francisco has still one of the biggest racial disparities in its jail population, and we really need to take a closer look at the reasons for that, and to maybe come up with some alternatives to incarceration that address racial disparity specifically. We started to do that. We've enacted a policy where we're no longer going to charge cases that arise from a traffic stop where the person basically was charged with a possessory crime, possessing some contraband after a search after a traffic stop, because we found, based on our review of the statistics and based on a lot of other studies that have come out, that a lot of those traffic stops are motivated by driving while black or driving while brown type enforcement tactics. So that's one thing we've looked at. We need to take a closer look at our current jail population and really try and get at what it is that's driving that racial disparity and address it. I think just more generally too, we need to look at alternatives to incarceration. We have alternative courts in place. We need to see whether or not we're really sending the right people to those alternative courts. Not everybody needs to go through an intensive court program. Some people may be able to just stay out of trouble for an extended period of time without contacts with the court system at all. And some people may need that kind of intensive supervision. But we need to look closely at what guidelines we have for who's eligible to participate in those courts, and to not just exclude people because, for example, they're charged with a strike, or they're charged with something more serious. Oftentimes, it's those people who really need the intervention, who really need the structure of an alternative court, rather than just warehousing them in jail for an extended period of time or in prison for an extended period of time, which we've seen doesn't reduce recidivism. So we really need to look at ways we can improve our alternative courts and reduce recidivism while maintaining public safety. And the other thing I think we need to look at is are just generally alternatives to the criminal justice system as a whole. I know that DA Boudin is committed to increasing the opportunities for restorative justice. We have a robust neighborhood court program currently where people who are charged with misdemeanors and some low-level felonies can go before a panel of community experts, and the victims are also invited, and there's an exchange there between the victim and the defendant and the panel of experts, and there's some restorative remedy or solution that's crafted by that panel. It's had a lot of success, and those people who go through those programs are less likely to commit crimes. The recidivism rates are lower. So I think expanding the use of those types of alternatives to the existing criminal justice system are something that we're really interested in pursuing. Another example where both DA Boudin and I were involved as public defenders, and now we continue to support this program, is a program called LEAD, where law enforcement are actually allowed to refer offenders who have substance abuse problems for substance abuse related crimes or property crimes. Instead of taking them into custody, they're referred to a social worker. And if they follow up with that social worker, the charges are dismissed. So it's a relatively low threshold to get the charge dismissed. But what it's shown is that the individuals who participate in that program continue to maintain relationships with those social workers. And this was recently studied in San Francisco, and there was something like a 15% less likelihood, less chance of recidivism for the people who participated in that LEAD program than the people who participated in the ordinary criminal justice system. So it's looking at alternatives to incarceration more broadly, It's addressing racial disparity, and it's also making sure that we are vigilant that as we hit an economic downturn, and we may find more people homeless or more people struggling, that we don't look to incarceration as the answer to those social problems, that we continue to recognize them for what they are, which is oftentimes societal problems or public health problems. And we advocate for solutions from other institutions like the Department of Public Health, the Department of Social Services, the Department of Housing, to address those problems rather than thinking of jail as the way to solve those social problems. And I think that's particularly important as we hit this economic downturn and we see more people kind of facing desperate times.
I'm gonna turn it over to audience questions now. I'm just opening it and scrolling through some of them. The first one is from Roderick Rack. I'm a social worker, and 15 years ago, you defended a client of mine with disabilities. His parents still consider you a part of their family. What does it take for attorneys to connect with communities in this way? And how have you navigated your community connection as you navigate from a public defender to a district attorney or an assistant district attorney?
Well, I really appreciate the nice comment there. Good question to have as your first question. It's been a transition. I think as an attorney, I always try to see the human being, and I think I bring some of those perspectives now to my work. So even though I don't have client contact at this point, client contact meaning defendant contact, I still think of those experiences and those stories and those families that I met during the almost 17 years I spent as a public defender, and I try and think about cases that way, even as in my work as a district attorney. And I understand that very often there's a root cause behind much of the criminal conduct that we see, and there's a person on the other side of the bars in jail, or there's a person on the other side of the room. So I try and bring that perspective, but it is a challenge. At the same time, too, I have a new, I'm also aware more of some of the challenges that victims face. Sometimes there's an overlap between that community. The victim on one day can be a defendant on the other, and vice versa. And so I think I bring some of the perspective that I gained from thinking about the personal experiences of my client as a public defender to an understanding of some of the things that the victims that we see the public defender, the DA's office are going through. So, I think it's just taking the time to try and look at the humanity of every person and take that extra time to connect with people on a human level. And that works both in terms of, working with defendants and also working with victims.
The next question is from Nora. Nora writes, how are organizations that assist with housing dealing with a large influx of people who now need housing? Are they able to deal with the demand? Are they able to keep up, or are beds not available?
I think it's a good question. I think there's a couple of things. So far, the jail staff has been able to work with people who are being released early and people that we've identified to try and connect them to housing, and they've had some success. They've been working and marshaling resources through the Department of Public Health, Department of Housing, and other city agencies. So we have had some success at connecting people who are being released from custody into housing, into treatment programs. But I think it's a bigger issue. I think there are still a lot of homeless people who you see out in the street who have not been housed. I know that the Department of Public Health is trying their best, and the Department of Housing are working on it, but those are separate agencies. And I think one of the issues that we've had, and I observed as a public defender and still observe as a district attorney, is that there should be more cross-coordination between these different agencies. So the Department of Public Health should have more access to housing. The Department of Housing should be more involved with Department of Public Health clients. So I think there's a real need for better coordination there. And I don't think we are fully addressing the needs of the homeless population. I know that there's been some legislation that's been suggested by the Board of Supervisors But I think there's been some logistical problems, and as far as I know, we haven't moved to house, the 8,000 homeless people on the street directly into the vacant hotels that currently exist. So I think we need more work on that. But we have had some success getting people from jail directly into housing.
Okay. And this next question is from Sarah. Sarah writes, how do you determine who poses a low enough, how do you determine who poses a low enough of a public safety threat that they can be released? Where is that line drawn?
Well, it's a tough line. And, what I can tell you is that every case is looked at by multiple people in the district attorney's office. They balance the conduct in the case with a person's history, with a person's history of committing crimes in general, and also whether or not they have any violent criminal history in their background. We look at the nature of the charges and whether or not, for example, it's somebody that the person knew or didn't know, whether it seemed like an isolated incident. There isn't like a specific calculus. There isn't a specific equation, and there's judgment calls that have to be made, and sometimes those are difficult judgments. But we do err on the side of, public safety, and if we think that this person poses a public safety risk, we have not agreed to a release, and that has been the case on numerous occasions. At the same time, we are open to the possibility that even if someone has something in their background, if it's distant enough and remote enough, doesn't necessarily mean they shouldn't be eligible for release. So I can't give you like an A plus B equals C answer. I can just tell you that a lot of attention is paid. Many eyes are looking at the specific cases, and it's vetted not just by our office, but also by the courts and the sheriff's department on occasion and the probation department. So we're really trying to go out of our way to make sure that everybody's safe.
Okay. This next one comes from Alex. Alex writes, do you have any advice for folks who are working in the criminal justice sphere, who are in a city that doesn't have a DA who's as defense-minded as Chesa Boudin? Any thoughts on how folks can make inroads in more traditionally prosecutorial communities?
That's a great question. I think, first of all, I would say reach out. My information is publicly available. You can send me an email and I can share with you some of the policies that we've enacted, some of the evidence-based policy papers that we've relied on to justify some of the decisions that we've made. I think there are people out there who are isolated, and I think the more that we can reach out to those isolated folks and give them the tools that they need to advocate, the better. And I think the goals may have to be realistic. If you can change the lives of one or two or three people, maybe that's the way to start. But there are people out there who are willing to help. And I think one of the things that we've seen through this whole process is how technology can bring us all together. So I would say, reach out. Now is the time for us to build those coalitions and to work together and to share resources. And I want to say that I'm available if you want to consult about your particular situation. And I also say, I think there's probably people in your community who you can bring in. Our public health partners have been amazing. The jail medical staff. We have an agency called Pretrial Diversion that is working night and day to put people in housing. There are a lot of people out there who want to help. And I think that's the other silver lining from this crisis is we've seen that we can kind of broaden the coalition of people who are willing to work with incarcerated people and really come up with tailor-made solutions to individuals who need help. And so I would suggest reaching out to those other communities and those other agencies and seeing if you can enlist them as allies in criminal justice reform.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question. This one comes from Thea. Thea writes, can you talk a little bit about the mental health component of offenders within the jail system and innovative ways the DAs can incorporate addressing this into their dispositions while still making the victim whole?
That's a very good question. Mental health cases are complicated, but I think something that I learned from my 16 years as a public defender talking to psychiatrists, they would tell you, jail is not treatment. Even if somebody is getting medication while they're in custody, that is not appropriate clinical treatment for someone who's got a serious mental illness or who's got mental illness. And we really need to build up our treatment programs that exist outside of the walls of our jails. We can't rely on jails as being the biggest, as is in Los Angeles and in New York City, the biggest mental institutions in the country. So I think as a DA, I think DA Boudin is committed to, advocating for more community-based resources and community-based approaches to mental health treatment and not relying on jail. I think we also need to streamline the process for getting people out of jail and into treatment programs. There are a lot of hoops that have to be jumped through to get someone into a treatment program. I know when I was a public defender, sometimes it would take 3 or 4 months of someone being in custody who was ready for treatment, who wanted treatment, to get placed into a secure facility or a facility that had adequate treatment. And so we really need to try and figure out ways that we can streamline those referrals and get people out of jail and into appropriate treatment facilities more quickly. We need to also expand our mental health courts and not necessarily require people to plead guilty to participate. There's been some major changes in California. We now have more opportunities for diversion for mental health, which doesn't require a plea. And I think that's going to incentivize more individuals to participate. I think if you're requiring someone to plead guilty and then you're tacking on a lot of additional requirements, then it's often easier for either the defense lawyer to fight the case or for the defendant to just say, well, why would I do that? Why would I sign up for even more requirements? So I think mental health diversion is a good pathway to get people into treatment without necessarily requiring them to plead guilty. And then finally, we just need to have pathways outside of the criminal justice system, alternatives. There's a program in Portland called Cahoots, where crisis workers respond to calls for service instead of police officers. They're the first responders, people who are trained, who know how to navigate the social service system, and who can shepherd people into the right treatment modality. We can't rely on police officers to do everything. They have a very tough job, but they just don't always have the training that it takes. And I think they would tell you the same thing. To get someone into the right program, to navigate all of the different systems that it takes to get someone who has a mental health problem treatment. So I think thinking about programs like Cahoots is another thing that we can do so that we don't just channel everybody who has a mental health issue into a program. And we have to keep people safe. We have to make sure that people have stay-away orders that are enforceable. We have to make sure that there's communication with victims so that they're being notified of changes to somebody's custody status. We have to do a better job of communicating with victims and making them feel like they're in the loop and they're safe. And oftentimes those victims are family members, and what they really want is treatment. They don't want their person to languish in custody. They don't want their person to languish in jail or sent to prison where the chances for recovery are slim. So I think sometimes we have a natural ally in who the victim actually is.
Mm-hmm. It's so true and such an important point. I think that we're out of time now, but thank you, Tal, so much for making time to talk. It was really interesting to hear your perspective. Thanks everyone for your great questions, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Samantha. Thank you, Tal. Thank you both so much. I just want to say I appreciate both of you on behalf of everyone here at Manny's. Samantha, thank you for your reporting, and Tal, thank you for fighting the good fight. There's so many thousands of people who may not know your name and may never know your name, and it's unsung heroes like you that make me proud to be a San Franciscan. So thank you for fighting for people's rights. I'm proud to know you. And Samantha, thank you for shedding light on the work that people like Tal are doing.
And thank you, Manny, for providing this forum and for providing, the 100 other forums to improve, social discourse and civil discourse. Really appreciate you.
Thanks, Manny.
Before we end, I just want to say Mother Jones is a non-profit publication So if anyone is willing to support an important institution devoted towards a good, strong, solid investigative journalism, please go to motherjones.com. Is it .com or .org? Do you know?
.com.
.com, and subscribe to Mother Jones. They need your support now more than ever. So subscribe to Mother Jones. Be a hero. Thank you, Tal. Thank you, Samantha. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.